when it began, the kind of entrepreneurial energy and the kind of technological expertise that you needed in order to solve that problem, which was to, dig this sticky, complicated substance out of the ground in a hostile environment and get something viable energy-wise out of it. It was extraordinary. But I think that has sort of disappeared, that they're now they're functioning as well as they need to, and they're not going to make much in the way of technological improvements on any front, whether it's environmental or, production, because they can just sort of coast along and take the profits that they're taking.
Hey there, it's Ed. I'm sharing another episode of my occasional podcast called Climate Book Reviews. Though with all the great climate-themed books coming out these days, it's becoming a little less occasional. I co-host it with Dr. Roger Thompson, Director of Writing Programs and Professor at Arizona State University. Our goal with the pod is to curate some climate energy-related books worth knowing about. In this episode, we dive into the sharply drawn and darkly funny world of On Oil, the latest nonfiction work by acclaimed Canadian author Don Gillmor. On Oil is a slim and punchy examination of the most earth-altering industry of our time. Drawing from Gillmor's early years working on Alberta oil rigs and his deep experience as a journalist and novelist, the book traces how oil has shaped not only our landscapes and economies, but also our politics, foreign policy, and our public imagination. We had a lively and wide-ranging conversation with Don about the inspiration behind the book and how the oil industry, like characters in a novel, is navigating a world in flux. I think you'll enjoy it. For more information, visit climatebookreviews.com. And now over to Roger. Happy listening.
Hey, Roger. How are you doing?
Doing great. How are you doing?
Good. Hey, just for this podcast recording, because Don writes of so many organizations and characters and events that I'm familiar with from my time working in and around the oil and gas sector, particularly when I was at the Pembina Institute. I'm going to have to resist the temptation to get into the war stories, and especially with some of the more colorful characters. So just as you being the hostess with the mostest, feel free to rein me in if I get too down a story.
No. I think we want war stories if we can build them up. I think that's absolutely great, and probably our listeners will really enjoy hearing those. In fact, I think we want to start that way with some of Don's old stories as this book kind of traces out. And I've got lots to say about this book, as sure you do, Ed, especially given your connections to the oil sands. Don, it sounds like you have experience working firsthand in the oil sands. So I'm wondering if you could just give us, and you trace this out, you give us some really lovely narrative in the book about your time there, really colorful narrative and really great read. I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about your experiences there and then how that laid the groundwork for this book.
Well, I was living in Calgary in the 70s. I moved there. I was at the University of Calgary in 1972. And I was looking for a summer job, and everyone said, well, you got to work in oil. That's where all the money is. So a friend of mine and myself, we just went downtown and we dropped off our very slim resumes to every oil company. And finally, a secretary said to us, you two idiots are never going to get a job like this. If you want a job in the oil rigs, drive out to the rigs. And so we rented a car. We drove east towards Medicine Hat, where this huge gas field. And the first rig we stopped at had a sign saying, this rig has worked 0 accident-free days. We thought, well, there's a job opening here. And there was a guy sitting on a 40-gallon drum with his hand all wrapped in gauze. There was blood all over his jeans, and he's obviously waiting to be taken to emergency. But even with that, we couldn't get a job. The guy said, you don't have any experience. We don't need you. But we drove around for 3 days, and we finally got to a rig where the whole crew hadn't shown up, and which wasn't that unusual back then in the oil fields. And this was early 70s, so we had long hair and our Grateful Dead T-shirts on, and the driller just looked at us and said, well, I guess you girls will have to do, and hired us both. And that was the beginning of my oil career, basically. And I mean, the job was terrible, but it paid a lot, and it was 7 days a week. This was, there was camp jobs where you kind of went in and out, but with the out on the prairies, you would work 8 hours a day till you went back to school. And so the whole summer was the oil world. And because I was an English major, it was a very colorful subculture, especially back then. So it had a lot of appeal in a kind of perverse way.
Just sorry, one. All right, I'll already get into a story on accidents. I remember Don being on a Greyhound bus when I was at the Pembina Institute. I used to get from Calgary to Edmonton and back by Greyhound. I'd advertise to say it's the cheapest way to go, and you'd meet lots of colorful characters along the way. And I sat next to a guy who was still visibly bleeding through his sock down into his foot and his shoe. And while he was sitting there, he was actually, there's enough blood that it was starting to drip onto the floor of the Greyhound. He had just come from a site. He'd had some accident that had left this huge gash in his upper ankle that was causing the bleeding. And he said, listen, my foreman he went to an ATM. He got out $2,000. He gave it to me and he said, go disappear for a week and go get drunk. And it was already I think 10 a.m. and he was already halfway there to getting drunk. And the whole thing was his foreman didn't want him on site. They didn't want a WCB claim, Workers' Compensation Board claim. Just go disappear, have a bender for a week, and then come back when you're all healed up.
Here's the oil health system in action. My goodness.
Nothing like more alcohol to coagulate the blood stronger.
Yeah, exactly.
Together. Well, Don, at the time then, I mean, you said you're an English major. Surely you weren't imagining a book at that time that might kind of speak to this.
I wasn't, but when I graduated, by that time I thought, I will write something about this. But I thought it would be a novel. And I tried to write a novel back then, and it never gelled. It was just a collection of kind of wacky anecdotes, and so I put that aside. I did end up writing a novel about oil called Long Change, which came out about, a decade ago. But it took me that long for the kind of novel part to percolate. Yeah, it was kind of a 30-year gestation period.
Great. So then what prompted the kind of return here to telling these stories in this format in this particular book?
What happened was there's a Biblioasis, which is the publisher based in Windsor. They have a series called Field Notes. And so they're essentially kind of long essays. And there's one on class, there's one on risk, one on failure. I think there's 10 titles out right now. And I have a novel with them. And the publisher there said, is there something in the Field Note world that you'd like to write? And I said, well, maybe I could write about oil because there's, a bit of memoir there. And plus, I reported on it off and on when I was a journalist. And this is sort of an interesting moment right now. I don't know if you ever read Peter Ma's book, Crude World, but the subtitle of that book was The Violent Twilight of Oil, which has always sort of stuck in my head. And I sort of feel we're in that moment right now. And I thought now would be a good time to kind of get this down, the nonfiction version.
This is reminding me of some of the discussion that you have throughout your book. One of the key phrases you bring up is this notion of a moral imperative for oil discovery and extraction. And I'm curious about that moral imperative and how it intersects with this violent twilight in your mind.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the moral imperative certainly when Alberta, when I was there, was all conventional oil for the most part. So it's all the oil rigs and the foothills and the prairies. And, the oil sands had just started in 67, I guess we would, call it their birth. And, they weren't making money. I think they were still viewed as folly by most conventional oil producers even. But when they were christened, and they really were christened, it was by Ernest Manning, who was the then premier of Alberta, and John Howard Pugh, who was the head of Sun Oil. And both of them were, strong evangelical Christians, and Manning still had his own Bible radio program while he was premier. I think they really viewed the oil sands as this gift from God, and I think Pugh came from that perspective. I think from his experience in Texas, where there was this strong correlation between oil and that brand of Christianity, and that there was this sort of moral imperative to extract as much oil as possible, and this would benefit mankind.
Yeah, this is, for me, as someone who grew up in Oklahoma, this was one of the most intriguing and to me, one of the most thoughtful parts of your book, which I want to say it's a brief book, but it's a engaging book and well worth someone picking up and reading. And part of it is this point, and you point to other people who have spoken about it as this kind of intersection in certain parts of the world and the country of faith, religion, and oil extraction. I'm reminded of a family story. There's when I was a child, there was a guy in Fort Worth, who had decided that the Bible had given him the sign as to where oil in Israel was. And it was based around this idea of the foot of Asher and the tribe of Asher. And so as this area outside of Haifa, and he was convinced, right, that the oil would be there and that Israel would finally become free from dependence on other countries for energy. And so so this kind of nation building linked with faith, linked with oil and energy extraction and deployment. I mean, you do a really nice job of kind of, well, not surveying it, but illustrating why that's important to understanding what happens with oil exploration around the globe. I think this is a really meaningful contribution here.
Yeah, and I think, you see evidence of it now. I mean, it's less so in Alberta now, but certainly in Texas. I mentioned the book Tim Dunn and Ferris Wilkes, two oil guys who are both evangelical Christians and who are convinced that this is the destiny, and anyone who's opposing this is essentially aligned with the devil, and that really creating that kind of old school dichotomy, I think, which is to their advantage, has really created this, kind of fascinating and kind of biblical landscape down there.
You also, Don, I like your chapter when you talk about the resource curse. And of course, in Alberta, where I live, that's an ongoing conversation, especially when at any given time, a government's budget is based, somewhere to the tune of 25 to 30% on resource revenue, which is a rapidly cycling commodity price, which means it goes up and goes down, and we have good times, we have bad times, and we have surpluses, and then we have debts. But you also dealt with Equatorial Guinea and Nigeria. And it reminded me, and actually just recently over at Energy versus Climate, another podcast that I'm part of, we had a woman named Rose Mutiso on, and we talked about energy transition in sub-Saharan Africa. And I told the story of some of the work I'd do as an advisor to Shell Global, including meeting with Shell's country chair at the time, a guy named Osagi Ukumbor, country chair for Nigeria. And talking, so you deal with Nigeria and its resource curse. What you might have omitted in that story was how you get a big company like Shell, which definitely, has received its fair share of criticism, including in Nigeria. And I think of Ken Saro-Wiwa and his execution in the 90s and Shell's complicity in that. But here I was at the highest level of Shell saying, we actually want to get out of Nigeria, but we can't, because we account for 25% of GDP. And if we pull out, we're going to bankrupt the country immediately. And then a Chinese state-owned enterprise is going to come in, and we're worried that they're going to be far worse than us. And one of the reasons they wanted to get out of Nigeria was because of the safety issues that you talked about, and the fact that at any given day, 1 to 3 out of every 10 barrels of oil produced goes missing for some cottage industry where it's refined and at the great expense of the Nigerian Delta. In terms of environmental cost. So it's just this lousy situation, not just for the country in many ways, but also for a company that is the cornerstone of the oil and gas industry there. I don't normally defend Shell, and I don't normally defend oil and gas companies, but it was very interesting to hear the country chair for Nigeria speak very eloquently about it.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting problem because, at the last COP conference that you had the environmental minister of Nigeria saying something to that effect, that there's just no way that they can make a transition quickly, and maybe they can't even make one slowly at this point. And I think this is sort of the bind you get into, that once oil kind of takes over the way it has in a country like that, you're not left with any alternative, because the industries that have been eroded by the fact that oil's kind of taken over the entire economy, either they can't come roaring back, whether it's agriculture or fishing because of degradation of environment, or that the expertise is no longer there. And so you do create this problem that can only be solved by you in effect. I mean, as you say, Shell ends up being the best solution to this problem that in effect that they've helped create. Yeah.
I mean, would you apply that equally to Alberta as you would to Nigeria?
Well, to a degree, they're suffering from the resource curse as well. To a degree, they're going to be left with some of the same problems. One of it's just a question of scale, that Alberta is so massive that, so much of this is happening off stage, basically, for most people. And when it comes time to clean up, it's going to be a problem that I think no one will be able to afford. Certainly the government won't be. At that point, I don't think private enterprise will be as well. There's not enough money put aside right now. So you're going to end up with, I think, in principle, some of the same issues, but on a different scale.
Are there obvious pathways? I mean, I'm curious, Ed, your response to that question also.
So I'll start. Alberta has, Don, you introduced the concept of orphan well sites in Alberta. And an orphan well is, essentially a well that's been abandoned by an oil and gas producing company. And it's left as this kind of environmental insult on the landscape. And Alberta has sort of on the order of hundreds of thousands of orphan wells. I'd have to go back to my time. I was briefly on the Alberta Energy Regulator Board until Jason Kenney wanted to show me the door, but I quit before I could get fired. But we were looking at it then. And this is the problem when you have, say, a couple basically an oil and gas entrepreneur, a wildcatter, who then hits up a couple orthodontists in Calgary and goes out and sinks a couple wells and then runs it till it's profitable and then goes belly up and then leaves that behind. And there's not enough money there to pay for the cleanup. So the amount of money that Alberta has set aside for cleanup is a fraction of what the liability is. And that's before we get to some of the liabilities in the oil sands around tailings ponds. So there's this constant discussion of, should we set more money aside? What's the responsibility of the federal government? What's the responsibility of the provincial government? And the one thing that in COVID relief that the province and the feds could agree upon was, okay, well, let's create jobs and let's actually spend some money to clean up these wells. That's a good thing. But really, the solution is make sure that companies set aside enough money before they develop so that there is money set aside. And the ones that have already been left on the landscape, unfortunately, it comes down to the public purse for the most part, unless you're capturing more of that wealth from the companies. But of course, the companies themselves don't like it when you ask them to set more money aside or you increase their taxes. And generally, Alberta considers its competitive advantage here as maintaining a low tax environment.
Right.
So that wildcatter can go hit up the orthodontists and start producing.
Well, I imagine with the oil sands in particular, it's a required advantage that they have, right? I mean, it's already so expensive anyway. If you add further tax to it, what's the incentive at that point to exploit that land, that resource at that point? Mm-hmm. I would assume. In fact, that kind of brings me to one of the things that I thought was what for me was one of the most useful chapters, and it's early in your book, Don, is this kind of survey, brief history, and it's not long, but it kind of coalesces all the core issues of the oil sands. It's early. It's a kind of, I think you pose it as kind of not just a time of transformation, but this kind of myth building around what the oil might do for Alberta. And I just found that chapter really engaging and really helpful, right? As someone who's not in Canada, who knows a bit about the oil sands and the problems with extraction there, both in terms of physically and for the industry, but also in terms of the results of it and for the local population. So that kind of survey was really helpful. I'm going to be pointing people to it, right? As hey, if you want to try to have a snapshot of the oil sands and the issues at stake, it's going to be there. And I'm curious about, in kind of crafting that chapter, how much that was for you, if you were trying to highlight certain features in particular, or whether you were really just trying to give a quick history in some sort of way.
Well, yeah, I wanted to do a kind of just a quick history. And, one of the things that I find interesting, especially now, is that when it started, it was essentially this sort of American-Canadian co-production. And then, once they kind of changed the tax rules and the royalty rules, you suddenly had this massive influx of foreign capital. And, the Japanese and Chinese, everyone was kind of getting involved. And then kind of all those people pulled away in the last decade for the most part. And you're now back down to these sort of six, Calgary headquartered companies. They're not necessarily Canadian owned, but they're headquartered in Calgary. and they now control 95% of the oil sands. And so you started as this sort of Canadian American enterprise, and you're kind of ending as one as well. I think when it began, the kind of entrepreneurial energy and the kind of technological expertise that you needed in order to solve that problem, which is to, dig this sticky, complicated substance out of the ground in a hostile environment and get something viable energy-wise out of it. It was extraordinary. But I think that has sort of disappeared, that they're now just, they're functioning as well as they need to. And they're not going to make much in the way of technological improvements on any front, whether it's environmental or, production, because they can just sort of coast along and take the profits that they're taking.
Yeah. And this is something I think people need to understand about the oil sands, which is still this very large pool of potential oil reserves, but also carbon. The companies up there. So Don, you're right. It's become basically Canadian companies plus Exxon. And I was there, when I was at the Pembina Institute, where you had a whole bunch of different Western industrialized countries. And sometimes there's state-owned enterprise like Statoil when it was owned 70% by Norway. You had, the French company Total get in. You'd mentioned Japanese company Jacos, which had a demonstration project so they could get privy to it. All of those companies have left. And right now, the Canadian companies plus Exxon through Imperial, they're essentially moving toward like an income trust model that they realize you're not going to grow. There isn't a license to plug in billions in new capital to develop, new oil sands mines. They can't get the approvals, or, increasingly they think that the demand for the oil that they produce is not going to grow. And if anything, oil demand is going to peak, and then there'll be, it won't decline. It'll be a long sort of peak and flatlining. But Canadian oil, regardless of carbon management or carbon policy around the world, just is very expensive and occupies a niche market. So you say, okay, we won't build anything new. So we're going to take what we have and just optimize so that what we do produce is profitable. And then as soon as it becomes unprofitable, you close down. And that is a very different model to the one that, Don, you write about in the heady days of the 90s and the 2000s and even to the 2010s, when the companies were tremendously growing and they're going and throwing their names on new community centers or hockey arenas or colleges or whatever it was. When you're functioning as an income trust, you cut out all the fat, you distribute all your proceeds as much as possible to shareholders, you lower your debt, and again, as soon as you become unprofitable, you just close up shop.
That's a disturbing thought. Yeah, that's interesting. And something I wanted to ask you, one of the problems I find in, reporting about oil is it's it's a moving target. And because, it's so tribal at the moment in terms of getting, valid statistics. So that, like a few days ago, OPEC came out and said, demand is going to grow 44% between now and by 2050. And, you have the International Energy Agency saying, well, no, it's going to peak in the next 4 years, and all kinds of things in between. And so, trying to find what is the most reliable source of information is a real challenge. And where do you look at when you're looking at this?
You look at the OPEC stats, you look, as you say, at the IEA. I think the Eurasia group does very good work. And then there are a bunch of, like Rystad, there are a bunch of other forecasters out there that you can look at. But often they're talking about different things. I see that there's more of a consensus emerging that oil demand isn't going to shoot up. It's not going to be on this hockey stick-like trajectory anymore. But as oil reserves decline, you're still going to need new production to replace the production that's being lost, that's declining. So let's say oil demand peaks at 100 or 105 or 110 barrels per day, whatever, million barrels per day, whatever it is. You're still having to constantly generate new barrels as production dwindles. So they can both be right, but they're just talking about different parts of the oil and gas production curve.
Right.
I mean, you bring this up in your book. At one point, Don, in fact, I like the way you phrase it. You talk at some point. You talk about that there was an era in which when you had inconvenient facts, the goal was to make them invisible, right? To bury them, make them disappear. But now it seems to be in an era where we just make up counter stories, right? The counter facts. There's no attempt to suppress when you can just write a counter story regardless of what the facts are. And I can only imagine in a journalistic way how impossible that makes the job of kind of finding out the reality and what the actual facts are.
Yeah. And I think, oil is prone to sort of paradox anyway and contradiction. And you see right now, for example, where President Trump has said, what he wants to see is $40 a barrel oil. And on the other hand, he also is, releasing all these public lands for drilling and saying to the drilling companies, drill, baby, drill. You're not going to have a lot of fracking happening at $40 a barrel. At that point, very few fracking companies are going to be earning a profit. And he's a sort of extreme case. So I don't think he understands ecosystems aren't his strong point, sort of in seeing how things reverberate. But you see that in oil in a lot of different ways, that there's these sort of inherent contradictions. And that's one of the big challenges I think we face right now.
Yeah. And like that, I don't think Trump is going to be very successful in really jacking up oil and gas production in the U.S. beyond what it's already doing. It's very healthy. It's producing a lot. In the same way that no matter what he said about beautiful, clean coal, he really couldn't jack up coal production in the United States. In the same way that on this side of the border, Mark Carney is saying he's open for business when it comes to new cross-country pipeline. That's great. And the Alberta government is there with, cheerleader pom-poms. But the industry itself has still been largely silent. You haven't seen a proponent come forward and say, we see the business case for this. So I think ultimately this is for political ends. And the market is sending the signals of what it thinks oil and gas demand is going to do. And for North American, for the US and for Canada, it's saying, well, we don't have the same kind of irrational exuberance as our politicians have. And we're going to take a much more of a cautious approach. While still, you see pockets booming, Don, like, where you talked about unconventionals or even conventional plays where you see, little spikes in production. But the big spike in production that we had in the 2000s and the 2010s, I just really can't see it happening.
No, and I think, the pipeline debate, which is, I think about to enter a kind of frenzied period very shortly, because, Danielle Smith has said, we will be coming up with a proposal. As you said, there's been this absolute silence on the part of actual pipeline and oil producers about building a pipeline. But she's kind of working on a coalition, I guess, of the willing in terms of pipelines. But, even if that were the case, if she's to assemble enough people in private enterprise who actually want to build a pipeline, if we're going west to east and they're talking about that 4,600 kilometer pipeline, of which 1,600 kilometers would be new and 3,000 would be retrofitted. If you look at Trans Mountain Pipeline as any kind of model, it was, I think, 960 kilometers, took 12 years to build, 34 billion. If we, use that as a kind of loose model, and, it takes, let's say, 15 years and 50 billion to build this, and some of that oil is for Eastern Canada, some of it's for export to Europe. But, what does the European export market look like in 2040 or 2042? Because my fear is that, that North America is sort of inching towards this sort of global energy backwater, that Europe and Asia are decarbonizing at a much higher rate. And we're going to end up looking like Cuba with these kind of old gas burning cars, running around. I think that's the heart of the pipeline debate is, what happens when that pipeline is finished, in more than a decade from now.
I'm reminded of something I've heard Ed talk about on energy versus climate, and that you bring up in your book also, the kind of, and you've mentioned just now, paradox of the oil industry, that both Texas and Alberta, oil central, also happen to be the ground zero for the big development on renewables in North America. And so there's this tension there. And I do think part of Trump's attempt to kind of dial down Biden's mandate for increased renewables and trying to tamp that down, the resistance he's gotten to that, I think speaks to what both of you all are talking about, that the market uptake on some of this on the renewables is developing and is energetic in a way that the oil industry may not be.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, it's interesting to see the development in Alberta where, by far, it's a province with the most renewable energy projects. But when Danielle Smith put that moratorium on new projects, it dampened investment, understandably. And I think, she, as well as others, have been talking about this concept of being an energy superpower. And I just don't see how you can be an energy superpower based solely on fossil fuels, because you have a market that is international and quite easily manipulated. And you really need the renewables there. And I think she missed that moment where Alberta could have been an energy superpower, and still could be in the future. But you had a moment where you had all this renewable energy coming online. And I think with slightly better management of the oil sands and a robust renewable sector that's supported by the government rather than hindered by the government, would change that landscape dramatically. And so it's a mystery to me why she's so, vehemently opposed to those projects, and why she puts the kind of hurdles in their way that she, in fact, removes for the oil and gas industry.
Yeah, and putting a moratorium on a renewable electricity market in a way that her government would never do on oil and gas production, even though in 2005, and you wrote about this, Don, Peter Lougheed, the venerable saintly Peter Lougheed, who was one of Alberta's great premiers, and he was premier for, it's a decade and a half, had actually gone up to the oil sands and saw the extent of the production and the growth, and did the 2+2 math very quickly. And that is, it's pretty clear that environmental management systems weren't keeping pace with that pace of development. You mentioned, by the way, this old report that we put out, Oil Sands Fever, from 2005. I remember being part of that report, and that was exactly what we're saying. And we, being the Pembina Institute, is that our environmental management systems aren't keeping pace. And Peter Lougheed himself said, well, maybe we need to take a time out. Maybe we need a pause on new development. And he was laughed out of the room as being like a socialist at the time. And now what did the Smith government do in 2023 in the summer? But do exactly that, put a moratorium on new renewable electricity development in the province, really is throwing red meat to her base that were concerned by, seeing Bob's, canola field next door be converted into a solar farm. Now, to be clear, you saw the pace of that development increase exponentially. So you had people on the ground seeing a lot of changes very quickly, when there's no reason why you couldn't walk and chew gum at the same time, continue to develop new environmental management systems, new approvals, while still processing what was in the regulatory queue. But yeah, you can punish one part of the energy system while you would never inflict the same kind of punishment on the other part of the energy system. I will say just quickly on this energy superpower business, it was coined under the Stephen Harper government, perhaps by Stephen Harper himself. It's nonsense. Personally, I think Canada doesn't control any part of the global energy system enough to any degree to ever consider itself as an energy superpower. And in the way that, say, the United States is now a superpower, Russia, or, Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, I wonder if Saudi Arabia is the sole superpower, in that they seem to be the only one that can kind of single-handedly manipulate the international prices.
It's a good point. I think we're winding on time here. So, Don, I want to tee you up an opportunity here if there's anything particular you want to highlight. But even if not there, regardless, I'd like for you to speak a little bit of who you're hoping picks up your book, because it's an interesting book, because on the one hand, it's data rich, right? There's this kind of whole middle section where you're kind of tracing out the nuts and bolts of the reality, the facts, right, of what's going on. You've got this wonderful narrative elements that kind of show up throughout, especially front end and tail end, about your own experiences. And then you've got these kind of what I might call kind of moral ruminations, right? Philosophical implications of what our dedication to oil might mean. So I'm curious a little bit about who you imagine this book being most useful for. I mean, it was useful for me. I don't mean to ask that skeptically in the slightest. Instead, I'm curious about who you imagined as kind of your core audience here.
Well, I thought of the core audience as essentially kind of people who, like me, are consuming oil in some way, but don't have a real good sense of the complications and implications of oil. And I wanted something sort of concise and readable. And I have to confess that the first draft of this book ended after the second last chapter, after the rapture, which ends on this very kind of downbeat book of Revelations, coming apocalypse note. And the editor said, listen, could you do something to kind of give us a little bit of optimism at the end? And So I did write an epilogue that I started to look at, through a more, glass half full kind of lens. And I mean, there is a lot to be optimistic about out there. So I did put some of that at the end. So I would hope that people kind of take some sort of solace from that and recognize that there is a way out of this situation.
Don, I think it's wonderful prose. I find you're an amazing writer. So it's just able to breeze through. And frankly, in all the books on oil out there, I've never seen someone who can use prose the way that you do to talk about the production of it, which really is kind of miraculous.
Yep.
Your storytelling's great. And so I'd like to talk about one character that I know personally that shows up in your book, and then maybe one thing that for next time, a story that you could write. The character is Bruce Carson.
Yes, and a character is the right name. Yeah,
this is a guy I got to know personally quite well. And so, Roger, if you remember, he was an advisor to Prime Minister Harper. Then he was given this golden handshake, and the golden handshake was, I think, $25 million to run the Canada School of Energy and Environment. Bruce was, and he died a few years ago. He was a high-functioning alcoholic who would then, he'd say, okay, we'll come out for dinner, and it'd have these meetings. And the guy could drink anyone under the table, and then it'd still be up at 6 a.m., and he seemed to be clear-eyed and with it. I remember I hosted a dinner for the Japanese Consul General in Calgary. He showed up and he brought flowers, not just for the Consul General's wife, but for my wife as well. Said this really nice touch. And then he told his stories how he's talking to the Prime Minister on the way. I invited him to Pembina Staff Board retreat in Nordegg. He showed up with Kitty, Don. So Kitty was this woman who ran a brothel, unbeknownst to all of us, in, I think, North Carolina.
Yeah. Oh my God.
And the two of them were like teenagers. We had these staff board retreats at the time, like a children's camp before we went upscale and had it at a proper hotel. And I had staff coming up to me saying, every time I turn a corner, like Bruce and Kitty are just like making out. And he's got his tongue halfway down her throat. Kitty's walking around talking to my female colleagues saying, well, you really should have a push-up bra, honey, if you want to succeed in this world. Oh my God. And then he went to the liquor store at Nordegg. He bought up all the scotch in this little liquor store. And then he brought it to the assembly and he got my whole organization drunk. Like everyone, because he had all these bottles of scotch. It's like he was just this character. And I was with him, Don, when it finally all came to an end and it was all coming to light. And of all places, Aboriginal People's Television Network figured out that he had this criminal record, that he was illegally lobbying for his then stripper girlfriend's mother
to
get the feds to spend money on water treatment on reserve. And it was totally illegal lobbying. And I was sitting there and I was 2 feet away from Bruce in the basement of the Petroleum Club. My colleague, Tim Weiss, sends me this link and he's like, what the fuck? And you click on that. And that was the first time the story of Bruce went out.
Holy cow.
I was looking at Bruce and afterward, I'm like, Bruce, I got to talk to you, man. It's like, oh, no, he had to meet with a couple of people, including the head of CAP at the time. I got to talk to you. He's like, I can't hear it. Well, just send me an email. He was an email guy. I walked out of the Petroleum Club, queued up an email, sent him the link and said, I'm sorry, but your life is about to go apeshit. And that was it. That was the beginning of his massive, massive downfall and ultimately his conviction.
Wow. Did you have any communication with him after that?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, long after his dethroning, I met with him in Toronto on the edges of our big annual gala. We went to Starbucks and yeah, he was in sort of ratty jeans and a ratty winter jacket. And he was kind of writing this newsletter called the Daily Brief at the time, which he'd send out to, people including ex-prime ministers and Jim Prentice at the time. He once shared his whole BCC list by mistake. And you saw he had all these like high-powered conservatives on his email list. Wow. But he was doing like law clerk work to try to pay the bills. Oh, boy. And that ended up being the last couple of years of his life.
And was he still with his 21-year-old escort girlfriend at that point?
That didn't last. And I remember at the Fairmont Royal York in Toronto, talking to Kitty, and it was another Bruce Carson special. We had just about to go in and have a dinner, a very boozy dinner. And I saw Kitty, and I was about to ask him, oh, hey, how's Bruce? And she cut me off, and she said, he's fucking a stripper. There's no comeback for that.
Okay, well, there's my next book right there. It's going to be all Bruce all the time.
Yeah. So that's the character. I had to tell once I read that. That's just 3 Bruce Carson stories of many Bruce Carson stories. And then just for the next edition, the discussion I was part of between the CEOs and the environmentalists that led to the Alberta Climate Leadership Plan. That's an interesting story because you really had the heads. You had Murray Edwards, head of CNRL, Lorraine Mitchmore, head of Shell, Steve Williams, head of Suncor, Brian Ferguson of Synovus, and Rich Kruger, to start, who's now the head of Suncor, in sort of a clandestine way, meeting with the heads of the big environmental groups to talk about peace for our time. And it actually led to Alberta taking the single largest step on climate policy of any jurisdiction at any time. But the whole backstory of that's
and
pretty
did it hold? Like the big step that they took, did it stick?
Yeah. So the step that Alberta took became the basis for a lot of climate and energy policy that's still in place today. When we talk about the oil and gas emissions cap, and although it's much maligned by industry, that was something that the environmentalists and the CEOs crafted for the oil sands specifically. But it formed the basis of methane regs that are still in place today and other parts. I used to have the list at my fingertips. But yeah, it was influential, but that whole coalition that came together crumbled pretty quickly because we all got just filleted by our constituencies individually, CEOs and the environmentalists, for apparently selling out our communities.
Yeah, I was going to say, this didn't come without cost to you, Ed.
Oh, no. No real professional cost, but certainly, you lost some friendships as a result.
I mean, this speaks to one of the real core issues of energy more broadly, but certainly in the oil, is the solution is going to have to be cross-partnered, but doing so requires a type of collaboration that is going to create a lot of ire, right? Because it's going to require sacrifices on all sides that constituents are not willing to give. At least right now in the U.S., you have a clear line of demarcation as to what side you're on. And any attempt to reach across that, at least from one side, it results in significant blowback, right? Which is which is all but impossible to overcome in the current moment here in the States.
Yeah. I mean, very true. The tribalism is a little less up here, but do you think we could go back for the second round of meeting with the environmentalists and the CEOs? No.
It was a one-shot deal, one-time deal. Yeah, the conditions were right then. They're not right now, and I'm not sure they ever will be right again.
Well, that's not a hopeful place to end on. If we go back to your editor, in fact, I was going to tell you, Don, you're in good company. I don't know if you know the story of Crime and Punishment from Dostoevsky, but he ended his book in a pretty dark spot, and the editor said, "Nah, can you put something nice at the end?" So it ends in this kind of Christian story of redemption that's tagged onto the end of it, which stands out like a sore thumb, but at the time was seen as necessary for sales. And I would say that, your book, it certainly speaks to me. And I really appreciate, I'm going to echo what Ed said, your ability to kind of distill some of the core, not just facts and machinations of the industry, but also just some of the core issues, and to really not just concise, but direct and illuminating prose. It's really admirable. I will be pointing, there's certain chapters in particular that I just think are just, spot on. The stuff on the rapture, the stuff on the, like I said, on the summary of the development of the oil sands. I just find these really great, useful chapters that I hope people will read.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Energy versus Climate. The show is created by David Keith, Sarah Hastings-Simon, and me, Ed Whittingham, and produced by Emmett Tandon. Our title and show music is The Wind-Up by Brian Lips. This season of Energy versus Climate is produced with support from the Trache Family Foundation, the North Family Foundation, the Palmer Family Foundation, and our generous listeners. Sign up for updates and exclusive webinar access at energyversusclimate.com and review and rate us on your favorite podcast platform. This helps new listeners to find the show. Thanks for listening.